Everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from central Colorado, about 12,500 feet, just below a fairly sizable snowfield on a mountain I was climbing. I figured this moment was the best time I could think of to talk about the Arctic. A lot of you have written in and wondering if we're on the verge of a new era of exploration and exploitation and development. Can't rule it out, but a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, the Arctic is, for the most part, completely unpopulated. And so even if you have a wonderful mineral resource, you then have to go into tundra in order to build roads or ports or airstrips. Tundra is not great land to deal with. In the summer, it tends to turn into a full-on swamp. So if you're going to have a town, it has to be elevated. And if you're going to have a road, it has to be on a raised berm that stretches hundreds, if not thousands of miles, which is why most of the remote places in Russia and Canada for mining aren't on the road network. You basically fly in, and then the place is just a frozen version of hell in the winter. If you want to do offshore, you're not just dealing with ice, you're dealing with moving sea ice, which means that most of what you have to do has to be under the ice, and yet it still has to be pumped back to the shore where it can be stored until the ice melts in the summer. So now you also need storage. So your cost for development for facilities up there is very high. The maintenance cost is extreme, and you're not going to be able to have a regular income stream because you can only ship out seasonally. Then there's the problem that where there are populations on the or above the Arctic Circle are very, very limited. You basically have two categorizations. The first is you've got the Russians, because during the Soviet period, the Soviets saw the entire Arctic zone as a zone for national security, and even though it made no economic sense, they settled people up there to the tune of a few million. Now, the vast majority of those people have found ways to get back to warmer climes, but there are still places like Murmansk and Norilsk that are way up there. The thing is, no one is going to sink the capital and technology that is necessary to develop the Russian Arctic. Exxon was doing a little bit on this in places like Murmansk and Vendré, I'm sure I mispronounced that, sorry Russians, and the Yamal Peninsula, but in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, that money's gone away. And there aren't a lot of companies on the planet that have any sort of experience in dealing with this sort of thing. The Russians do have some limited skills. Obviously, they've got plenty of experience. The problem is that the gutting of the Russian demographic structure is well underway, and the youngest people who were trained in the Soviet period with the full suite of technical skills necessary to do things like this, they're in their early 60s now. There just aren't enough people out there to do it, and the Russians have never had the capital to do it in any sort of scale. The other classification are places where the normal rules of the Arctic do not apply. There are a couple of places in the poles where warm water currents wash up against the coastline of the continent and make it a zone that is ice-free year-round. And the one that matters there the most is the North Atlantic drift going up to northwestern Europe. So the entirety of the Norwegian coast is ice-free year-round. And that's one of the reasons why Norway has become one of the world's preeminent energy powers, because they can go into the offshore oil and natural gas zones and produce year-round. They still have to deal with the depth. They still have to deal with offshore. They still have to deal with relatively light population densities. They still have to deal with storms. But at least they don't have to deal with moving sea ice. And as a first world country, they have capital access that the Russians simply can't match. The thing, however, though, is it's already ice-free. If you want anything more than what you've got right now, you've got to wait for the pole to melt out. And I have not seen a single estimate that suggests that the Arctic Ocean will be ice-free in the winter before the end of the century. Remember, the problem isn't just ice. It's seasonal ice that moves. And then the other issue is if you're not after resources, you might be after transport. The idea that you can ship things from Europe to East Asia back and forth much more easily than you can going the southern route through Suez or around Africa and India. Well, technically there might be something to that, but again, seasonal sea ice, you have to wait for the place to be ice-free. Otherwise, all the aids to navigation have to be redropped and recharted every single season. So again, seasonal route. And even if you're relying on an icebreaker, that icebreaker is going to be Russian. And in the current environment, there aren't a lot of people who want to rely upon the Russians for safety in times when there's distress, because for several thousand miles of empty trackless ocean and ice, there is no one else you can call. Finally, if you're going to do this, you're connecting East Asia, the most rapidly aging part of the planet, with Western Europe, which is the second most rapidly aging part of the planet. So you're making a long-term bet on two regions that demographically are not going to be able to trade much at all for much longer because they simply don't have any consumption that is going to be sustainable in the long run. So I don't think without a series of technological breakthroughs that are not very likely, we're going to see a lot of development up there. Everyone will play. Everyone always plays. But this is one of those things at the top of the world that's just going to stay there. All right, that's it. Take care. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you with the most recent in our Ask Peter series. Today the question is about thorium power. Now, there's uranium-based nuclear power. Thorium is a potential substitute. It's a different element, different chemical process. And according to its promoters, thorium is better because it is more difficult to turn into nuclear weapons on the back end. So if you can remove a lot of the proliferation concerns of a uranium power cycle, then maybe we can get rid of some of the obstacles to adopting nuclear power on a broader scale. The short version is probably not, but to understand that, you have to understand how uranium works. So when you mine uranium, you get something that is basically ore where a very small percentage of it is usable. Uranium decays over time, over decades, over centuries, over millennia, and you only get a few tenths of a percent of it that is actually the stuff that you need. So what you have to do is you have to mill it to get rid of all the stuff you don't need at all, and you're left with raw uranium in a form that they call yellow cake, which is a powder. And then you complex that in a compound called uranium hexafluoride, which is solid at room temperature. So you then heat it up a lot and throw it into a gas centrifuge where you spin out the different isotopes. When nuclear material degrades, half-life, all that good stuff, it comes up with different atomic weights. And by putting it into a gas chamber and centrifuging it down, you can increase the cut of the part that is actually fissile that you can use to achieve an atomic reaction. And in the case of a civilian power system, you're after something between 3.5% and 5% roughly. Everyone has their own preferred mix, but that's usually the range. Now, once you have that kind of enriched fuel, you then compound it into a structure like a fuel rod, and then that goes into a nuclear power reactor where it goes through fission. The fission generates heat, the heat drives turbines, the turbines generate the electricity. That's grossly oversimplified. That's basically how it works. Okay. On the back side, when you have a spent fuel rod, what has happened is that the uranium, that is the fissile component, has changed. And now its waste material is plutonium. And people can take the plutonium from spent nuclear fuel rods and make plutonium-based nuclear weapons. Now, if you're going to do something with thorium, the problem is it doesn't make it too much better. Plutonium is still the byproduct. And while you don't generate as much plutonium from the use of thorium in your nuclear reactor as you do from uranium, you still get some. In addition, you need a different kind of reactor. The fuel rod fabrication system is different. The purification system is different. The nuclear power reactor system is different. So in exchange for doing a completely new fuel cycle and a completely new power cycle, you're only getting like a quarter less plutonium. Now, yes, it's in a slightly more complicated chemical mix. It does require a little bit different equipment, a little bit more skill in order to extract a thorium-based plutonium byproduct. But the people who are making nuclear weapons aren't doing it for economic reasons. And if you have a standard 1 gigawatt uranium-based nuclear power system, you're going to generate enough waste plutonium every year to make about 6 to 12 crude plutonium devices. You do this with thorium, you might only have enough for 4 to 10. It's a marginal difference, honestly. So it's an interesting technology. And for countries like India, who have a lot more thorium than they do uranium, it's probably worth exploring just for power sake. But it's not going to solve anything on a non-proliferation issue. Neither is it a silver bullet that will solve the nuclear industry's problems. The big issues you have with the nuclear industry, in addition to proliferation, or you've got the spent waste you have to do something with. Now, in a uranium-based fuel cycle, You can recycle those rods, but doing so extracts the plutonium. And so now you've got plutonium sitting around in probably civilians' hands, which is one of the reasons why in the United States, we, for the most part, don't reprocess it. During the Cold War, it kind of worked because the military could take that plutonium away, but now the military has been slimming down its nuclear arsenal for decades. Demand just isn't there. There is no other use for plutonium, really. It's at least not in the volume that it produces this stuff. And so you're left with a waste disposition issue. Now, other countries have addressed this, if that's the right word, by having some sort of government facility where most of this stuff goes and is interred or is mixed with glass or is buried or whatever. None of these things really solve the problem, but they at least address them. In the United States, we've got something called Yucca Mountain, which is a big storage facility, but it's completely oversubscribed already, which means in the United States, right now, all that spent fuel, unprocessed typically, is stored on the reactor site in a coolant pond, which I would argue is not the best idea. But until we get a couple acts of Congress that either deal with the reprocessing and the plutonium extraction and or create a fundamentally new storage facility that can handle all of the volumes that we need to handle, we're kind of at a stalling point with the nuclear industry in the United States. Barring the development of fundamentally new technologies, of which there are a few interesting ones in play, we're actually going to be seeing nuclear power fall drastically as a percentage of our overall fuel mix. It's been about 20% of the total for the last few decades, but we've only had one new plant come online since 1973. And pretty much all of them are going to be decommissioned over the next 15 to 20 years, which we may have questions over whether that's a smart thing to do. But these facilities are a half-century old plus, which means that with all the solar and wind, assuming it's working perfectly, we're really just going to be standing still when it comes to generation of electricity, much less decarbonization. So this is a piece of the puzzle that we really do need to fix. And it really does require action from Congress. So I have very low hopes that that's actually going to happen, and I'm afraid that thorium isn't going to get us any closer. Sorry. Bye. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Chicago. I'm recording this on the 14th of November. You'll see it tomorrow on the 15th. The news today is that the APEC Forum, that's Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, it's a forum that was set up decades ago to help with economic integration among the Asia Pacific region, is having their annual Heads of State Summit in San Francisco, and everyone will be there. But as important that is, and whatever, the real issue is that there's going to be a bilateral standalone meeting between China's chairman, Xi Jinping, and America's President, Joe Biden. Now, there are any number of reasons why it would be a good idea to have a summit right now. There's big issues going on in trade and security. There's the Ukraine war. There's Gaza. There's energy. There's green transition. It goes on and on and on and on and on. I'd be very surprised if they actually meaningfully discuss any of those issues because there's a much more base problem, and that is China. China's cult of personality that has gathered around Xi Jinping has now become so strict that information is not being exchanged in the country. And Xi has basically shot the messenger so many times that he has very little idea of what's going on in his own country or the wider world, whether that's power outages or remember that spy balloon. We now know that Xi wasn't even aware of it until after the entire issue was over. So we, the United States, has tried on multiple occasions to meet with some of the uppity-ups high up within the Chinese bureaucracy and state authority systems and have discovered that really no one has reliable access to the chairman at all. So, for example, Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin have both been to China to speak with their counterparts only to discover that their foreign minister and their defense minister don't actually have access to the chairman. It hadn't for some time, and by the way, they both got fired shortly thereafter. So we're sending in the only gun that's bigger than SecDef and SecState, and that is the president himself. So Xi and Biden will be meeting the day you see this, the 15th, and I'm not expecting meaningful policy addressings. We're just trying to find out if the guy has lost his mind at this point. Once you turn 60, things start to go a little sideways, and Xi is now 70. And since no one, except for, say, Vladimir Putin, has had meaningful access to Xi in years, this will be the first chance for the United States to judge whether the guy on the other side of the table still has his faculties about him. And luckily, the person who's going to be judging whether or not the Chinese leader has failed because of age is Joe Biden. So, he knows what to look for.